Hello there, Vine community, and hello there, Matthew Smith. This is a response to your little challenge. You have always such interesting challenges. I still remember enjoying your decade by decade challenge this past summer at the balcony. So this one was also very interesting. You wanted us to show, take one decade and show our favorite albums uh, every year of that decade. And I was thinking of showing from the beginning. I was wondering if I'm not going to change style a bit and show some CDs from the 90s, but also thought that the final years of the 90s, 97, 98, 99, were not my favorite years in pop history. So I felt like it was going to be too hard to find favorite records from these years. 70s, my new favorite decade, but I felt also like I don't have that much 70s that I can fill with one record a year. But so my natural choice was the 80s. Now, I shown many of these records I'm going to show was also part of that chart that I did for Page Martin of the best albums of the 80s. It's records, many of these records I've shown over and over and over again in my movies. So I going to I hope it's okay with you, Matthew, that I do like you wanted Adam and Joe, Mr. Mayo, to do, to show us a secondary album. So I'm going to, in some years, show 2 years, one record, and in those years that I felt like this album was shown so many times, I'm also going to show a secondary album to have a little variation in my showings. So you still will have my favorite choice, but also another marvelous album. And also, before every year, I'm going to show a little list of other albums from that year that I feel is awesome, honorable mentions. So let's move on with the first year of the 80s. The first year of the 80s, of course, is 1980. It was a very hard year to do because it isn't my favorite year. It's a year that is a little in the gray zone between something new that was coming very soon and the old, the 70s. It's a little a year that I feel is lacking of color and imagination. But of course, there were some things that actually were good. And here is the album that I picked. It is a soul album that I've bought at the record fair, Sundsvall Record Fair, a couple of years ago. Shalamar and their album Three for Love. Shalamar with Jody Watley, Howard Jewett, and Jeffrey Daniel. I've become a huge fan of them because they are doing such a marvelous soul music. Really smooth, very funky, very relaxing and danceable. Contains everything. This is a really, really great group and a great album. Highly recommended. 1981, also a year that maybe not my favorite year of the 80s, but the synth pop and the British new wave music had begun to become very big, which of course will leave its mark on several albums in these first years of the 80s. And 1981 for me, of course, was a little, I had little choices to make here, but my natural choice was Depeche Mode's debut, Speak and Spell. Uh, maybe the happiest album that Depeche Mode ever made, filled with great synth pop music in its earliest form, Depeche Mode, very far from what they was turning into later on. But it still is a very, very interesting album and a great album for a debut. 1982, and now we're coming to the first year that I'm going to have two records, one primary choice and one secondary choice, because the first one I've shown over and over again, and I think it's natural choice, like Adam said in his video. Michael Jackson's Thriller, of course. A really, really masterpiece, Quincy Jones masterpiece, even though Quincy Jones himself prefer the album before that, Off the Wall, but I think this is a really, really awesome record. But I've shown that over and over again, so another record that I also like very much from 1982, a great year for synth pop, a new wave, A Flock of Seagulls, their self-titled debut. Flock of Seagulls, really awesome synth pop band, maybe with a little strange fashion taste, but they had really, really great production, really great melodies. I Ran, fantastic song. Space Age Love Song, really marvelous song on this album. And it's really filled with synthesizers and great dance beats. Really, really great album. Highly recommended. 1983, and here I had a little trouble choosing. I was close to choose the China Crisis album that you saw was mentioned before, but I finally choose this one because I felt it was a little more powerful. So 1983, my choice was Sparkle in the Rain by Simple Minds. Simple Minds here was the first time where they did their later on famous power stadium pop thing, going from being a synth pop band to a more tougher band with a lot of drums and strong melodies. And here you have Waterfront, you have Speed Your Love to Me, and this is a really, really, it's an experimental album in some form, and it's also a very, very beautiful and wonderful, powerful album. Really, really great album. 1984, and this year 84, 85, 86, I had huge trouble finding records that I didn't have on my best albums of the 80s, Page Martin's contests. So I'm just going to show these pretty fast because my secondary choice here is also an album that was a part of that chart. It is my favorite year, 84, 85, 86 of the 80s pop music. So 84, of course, is Alphaville, Forever Young. One of the best albums and most beautiful, most well-sounding albums ever. And secondary choice, of course, Madonna, Like a Virgin. Also a really classic, filled with songs that almost everyone is so awesome classics. 1985, also two albums that I picked for the best albums of the 80s. My first choice, Nick Kershaw, The Riddle. Also one of the best albums ever. I think it's the fifth time I'm showing this album, fifth or sixth time I'm showing this one in a year. My secondary choice also was there, but it was very much lower down. I haven't shown this one just as many times. Go West, British group, and their self-titled debut. Really an 80s classic, marvelous produced, and really sounds 80s all the way to me, British 80s all the way to me. 1987, 1986, sorry, 1986, also two albums from that was my favorites of the 80s. Having Level 42, my primary choice, Running in the Family. An album that is so wonderful made that I get goosebumps listening to it. My secondary choice is, of course, more Depeche Mode. Black Celebration, one of the best synth-pop albums of the 80s, no doubt about it. Question of Lust, you're having it doesn't matter too, and Fly on the Windshield, really great song. Windscreen, sorry, Fly on the Windscreen, really great album. 1987, picked one choice, even though this one was on the best album of the 80s. But I haven't shown this one too many times. Pet Shop Boys, Actually. To me, this is 1987 because I listened so much on the Pet Shop Boys during 1987. So this album is almost a summary for that year for me. 1988, finally a record that I haven't shown before. 1988 was also a pretty hard year because 1988 was not my favorite year in pop history. Came out so much crappy things back then that I actually didn't like then. Some of them I learned to like. I didn't like Stock Aitken Waterman's Bubblegum Disco back then. I do now. So it's turned a little bit better, but it was the songs from Dirty Dancing I think is horrible. Have Bros, Taylor Dane that definitely don't like. So it was so much things I didn't like. But I managed to find an album that I definitely liked and I bought in 1989, I think. I'm talking about yet another Level 42 album, Staring at the Sun. This is an album compared to Running in the Family. This is a little less commercial, a little less synthesizers, but still very jazzy, very funky, with some really great songs. The single Heaven in My Hands is a fantastic song, highly recommended, and the ballad Take a Look also really thoughtful and really relaxing ballad, so highly recommended. Maybe not in the same class as Running the Family, of course, but still yet an awesome album. 1989, finally. This album I've shown over and over again. Tears for Fears, The Seeds of Love, my primary and natural choice. Also an album that is so well produced that I get goosebumps listening to it. Fantastic album. And my secondary choice. It's an album that fits very well as my final album because it's wrap it up so well with starting off with the 80s that was very much the leftover of the 70s disco with Shalamar, coming into synth pop of the early 80s and pop music, the regular 80s pop, and wrap it up with what was going to become the modern dance music of the 90s. And what's going to become the modern music of the modern dance music of the 90s is of course the British house music, the European house music, and that I really like. And one of the best albums of 1989 in that genre is D-Mob's A Little Bit of This and A Little Bit of That, with much singing by Kathy Dennis, the same woman who wrote Can't Get You Out of My Head by Kylie Minogue, among others. This is really funky and really awesome produced album, really danceable, sounds really great, one of the best dance albums ever. So that was my 80s. It was very hard to choose actually, because I couldn't pick. There are many albums, especially from the years 84 to 86, that I could have picked, that I had to leave because I only could show one and one secondary. And but were so much great music in the 80s, and so I hope I'll be able to do this one more time. So I hope that you had a great time, Matthew, and that you liked my choices, and the rest of you also. So with that, I hope that you all have a great time and a great weekend, and I hope to see you soon, and so long.